Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes, and welcome to Books My Dad, who was a PhD in English Literature, thinks I should read because reading them improves my understanding of good literature, also known as Gwen aimlessly chatters about real literature. Okay, so I said a couple weeks ago that The Blue Sword was oddly appropriate to this week's real literature book, and that's because one of the thematic lines of The Blue Sword involves colonialism, because the so-called homelanders and or outlanders are from a place that is supposed to seem like, in some ways, England, and Damar is a sort of a pseudo-Middle Eastern country in certain ways. I mean, it's a whole fantasy universe, and Damar is not necessarily genuinely Middle Eastern because it's a fantasy universe and none of these people are real. But nonetheless, there's a line there about invading external forces who will never completely understand the local culture, partly because they don't want to and partly because, you have cultural boundaries. And it's very, very difficult to cross cultural boundaries because because not merely because of the fact that, when you have the conquering nation looking down on the conquered nation, that you have that barrier and the conquered nation doesn't want to help, but there's also just the cross-cultural problem that what we in the West would consider to be standard social mores are completely not how you do things in a Middle Eastern or Far Eastern country, or, as in the case of this particular book, Southeast Asian, or South Asian, because A Passage to India is obviously about India. Now, on the back, they make the person who wrote the back of this book points out that because this is a scrutiny of human nature and not a political analysis, this novel is unaffected by India's attainment of self-government. This book was first published in 1924, which is, you may have guessed, before the date that India attained self-government. Well, the thing about this book is that it's about, in some ways, the cultural misunderstandings that happen because, of course, India has always been very much, in a lot of ways, kind of a melting pot. One of our main characters is Muslim, but there's also a lot of going back and forth with Brahmin Hindus, with, Hindus generally. The thing is that there are a lot of religions that have reached a point of confluence in India, just due to historical forces. So the book, it opens with a Muslim Indian, and his meeting with an older woman who has come to India and accompanied a much younger woman because the younger woman, Miss Quested, is thinking of marrying the older woman's son. And so Mrs. Moore, who have, upon coming to India, both Mrs. Moore and Miss Quested, they want to see the real India. And it's an impulse a lot of people have when they go to a foreign country, in particular a foreign country that is more exotic than they're used to. It's one thing to say, I want to see the real England. The thing about England is it's not so culturally far distant from, say, Canada and the United States that seeing the real England is going to be walking into a completely alien, unknowable place. It's different. You cannot argue that it's different because every country has its fundamental differences, but there's a difference between the real England and the real India. So Mrs. Moore decides to look in on a mosque, and she has taken off her shoes as is required, and Aziz, who is one of the other main characters in this story, has found this woman in the mosque, and at first he remonstrates her that she should have taken her shoes off, and she says, oh, well, I left them there. I knew I should take them off. Did I do anything else wrong? And the two of them get to talking, and they sort of click. The problem is, though, that they click in an unfortunately superficial way that neither of them quite realizes how superficial it is. Aziz is very charming and complimentary and devoted to his religion, and Mrs. Moore is flattered by his complimentary and kindness, and he is equally flattered by an Englishwoman who isn't sneering down her nose at him, because it's something that happens with the English people who come to this country, is that they start off nice and then they turn awful. The thing is that this book goes through those forces that turn them awful, and those forces wind up coming from a couple of different directions, because of course there is the peer pressure, your fellow Englishmen and English women who tell you about how shiftless and wastrel-like these native Indians are, and you shouldn't spend time with the natives, and you hear it all the time from the people you spend time with, and it has its effect. But at the same time, there's a different side to this, which is that, understandably, the Indians tend not to be very welcoming. I mean, why should they be? This is effectively a continuing force which is holding their country in subjugation, and a continuing force that treats them poorly and acts badly in various ways and refuses to understand them or even put in the effort. The thing is, however, that when Miss Quested and Mrs. Moore attempt to make an effort, they are forcibly rebuffed when they go up to some women at a party that is arranged for them to have a chance to meet some real Indians, and they attempt to make arrangements to meet with these women in their home, to spend some time with them, to get to know them, to talk with them, to understand their culture better. And these women, instead of actually making plans, put them off and ignore them and effectively lie through their teeth by saying, oh yes, sure, come on Thursday. And instead of being there on Thursday when they suggested those women should come, when they said, yes, we'll send a carriage around for you, instead they just completely ignore it and go off to do whatever they were going to do. I believe it was they were heading to Calcutta that day. Well, if you treat people in this way, then yes, it's going to have a negative impact on their perspective on things. And so it's a problematic situation, because of course you can't blame the people who are being subjugated for being resentful and treating the people who are subjugating them badly, but at the same time, it's one of those problematic things that doesn't help, because of course when somebody comes along who does want to understand, when you treat them poorly, they rear back and decide they don't want to deal with it. Well, the meat of this book is actually about an unfortunate series of events where Miss Quested and Mrs. Moore wind up going on a trip with Aziz and several other natives, locals, one might say, to see the Marabar Caves. And the problem with the Marabar Caves is that they appear to be a Brahmin Hindu thing rather than a Muslim thing. And so when the Brahmin Hindu, who might have been able to properly explain the deeper, collective social meanings and whatnot of those caves, when he gets left behind, they're left with Aziz, who is very clever and witty and intelligent and interesting within a particular sphere, but his sphere is not the Marabar Caves. And the whole series of events, they wind up being taken into these deep caves that are, that they honeycomb this mountain, and these deep caves that are pitch black and have these amazing echoes in them, and that somehow the interiors are just these fantastically polished interiors, and you light a match inside and it reflects, and there's these echoes that just change everything into a deep booming sound. And it sounds like a very interesting and possibly intense experience, but of course, without the proper milieu, without a proper setup and explanation, they're just some very scary, dark caves. And Mrs. Moore winds up having a kind of a religious crisis after this, because she's an older woman, and she's getting to that point in your life when faith can start to dwindle because you see death coming, and indeed she does die, sort of 3/4 of the way through this book, that she got on a ship for home and died en route home. But she wound up having this just internal crisis. Miss Quested, on the other hand, she's trusting Aziz and she's going along with him, and she's not having as good a time, but she's trying very, very hard to, because she feels a moral obligation that after all of the trouble Aziz has gone to set everything up, that she should try. And she has this traumatic experience in the cave, and when she comes out, she rushes off, and when Aziz returns, because Miss Quested managed to get away and fled back ahead of them with a young woman who owned a car and is clearly a very fast young woman, and gave her a lift back to Chandrapur, and Miss Quested flies back, and she's in shock, and she's just had this tremendous experience where she knows she was grabbed, and it happened in the dark, and she tripped and she fell, and a whole bunch of things happened, and she's in shock. And when she gets back, the feeling I get reading this book is everyone else decided unilaterally that she had been sexually assaulted, potentially even raped, and and throughout the entire section of this, whenever you hear her perspective, she's very uncertain of what actually happened, and indeed when she gets up on the stand, she says, "No, I retract everything." And part of this is because you can feel the building of anti-Indian sentiment on the part of everybody, where it was everyone else, all the other Englishmen and women, who built this up into an assault case, whereas she was just in shock. And Aziz winds up resentful. He winds up very, very angry, and these burgeoning friendships fall apart because of everything else that surrounds them. And there's one more person in this who's of any real import, and that is a school teacher, a school principal. He's an Englishman, and he's a world traveler who prides himself on traveling light, on not having deep connections, on taking everything as it comes. And he's very sympathetic. But in the end, he goes home and he still winds up marrying an Englishwoman, and when he comes back to India, the friendship between him and Aziz is basically gone. They managed to resurrect it, but only resurrect it with the understanding that this is the last time they'll be able to see each other. Anyways, it's a complicated book, and I'm running out of time, and I've probably missed a whole whack of things that I should have talked about. But it's an interesting read. Not really my bag, but an interesting read. So there you go, and I think that's everything, and I'll see you all next week.